The emergency room of St. Jude's Memorial is dead silent, save for the rhythmic, agonizing beep of a failing heart monitor. Outside, the night is fractured by the sirens of 3 blacked-out SUVs tearing through the ambulance bay. On the floor, a single mother, a night shift trauma nurse named Clara, whose locker was cleaned out just 2 hours ago by a petty administrator, calmly ties her hair back. The hospital security team has already fled. The men entering the lobby are armed, professional, and looking for someone who doesn't exist on any local registry. They think they are walking into a defenseless building to eliminate a witness. They have no idea that the woman holding the sterile gauze has spent the last decade teaching the men who trained them how to survive. The fluorescent lights of the administrative suite hummed with a low, irritating vibration. Outside the double-pane glass, the city of Portland was dissolving into a heavy, slate-gray downpour. It was 4:30. The hospital was at its quietest, caught in that dead window between the late-night trauma surges and the first shift change of the morning. Clara sat perfectly still in the low-backed vinyl chair. Her hands were rested flat on her thighs, her fingers relaxed, unmoving. She wore standard-issue navy blue scrubs, a faded silver wristwatch with a heavy nylon strap, and scuffed, utilitarian trail shoes. To anyone looking through the glass, she was a tired, 40-year-old night shift trauma nurse facing the end of a long career. Across the desk sat Marcus Vance, the regional director of human resources. He was 10 years younger than Clara, wearing a sharp, tailored suit that felt entirely out of place in a building that smelled permanently of antiseptic and dried blood. He didn't look at Clara. His eyes were fixed on a digital tablet, his thumb flicking through pages of spreadsheets. The metrics simply don't support the overhead, Clara, Vance said. His voice carried the practiced, synthetic empathy of a corporate seminar. We're consolidating the trauma triage staff. We need personnel who are more proactive, more vocal. Your patient volume is steady, but your peer reviews mention a lack of integration. You're distant. In a fast-paced environment, silence can be interpreted as complacency. Understand, Clara said. Her voice was low, flat, and entirely devoid of inflection. There was no tremor of anger, no plea for leniency. Vance paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. He looked up, expecting tears, or at least a defensive counterargument. He had fired 12 people this week. They all argued. They all talked about their mortgages, their families, their dedication to the healing arts. Clara merely watched him. Her eyes were an opaque, weathered gray, the color of deep ocean water under a storm. "You're not angry?" Vance asked, leaning back, trying to assert a dominance he suddenly felt slipping away under her steady gaze. "Anger is an inefficient use of energy, Mr. Vance," Clara replied softly. "You have a budget ceiling. I'm a line item. The math dictates the outcome." Vance cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Right. Well, since this is your last scheduled shift, we've already processed your severance. Standard 2 weeks. Security has requested that you clear your locker before the 6 o'clock shift arrives. We need the space for the incoming rotational staff." "Of course." Clara stood up. The movement was fluid, economical, and perfectly balanced. She didn't use the armrest to push herself up. Her center of gravity simply shifted, and she was standing. Vance watched her, an odd, brief chill settling in his chest. For a fraction of a second, the way she stood, shoulders back, weight evenly distributed, chin slightly tucked, didn't look like a nurse who had just been terminated. It looked like something ancient and unyielding. But the illusion shattered as she picked up a small, empty cardboard box from the floor. "Good luck in your future endeavors, Clara," Vance said, already looking back down at his tablet. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. Good luck with the storm." Clara turned and walked out of the office, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. She walked down the long, linoleum corridor toward the staff locker room. The corridor was lined with framed posters detailing the hospital's mission statement: compassion, urgency, excellence. She didn't look at them. She knew every inch of this building. She knew that the 3rd floor had a blind spot in its security feed near the freight elevator. She knew the oxygen main shutoff valve in the basement required a cross-keyed wrench to turn. She knew the structural load-bearing pillars of the emergency wing could withstand a low-velocity impact from a medium-sized vehicle. She knew these things because her mind did not know how to unlearn the habits of a previous life. In the locker room, the air smelled of damp wool and lavender deodorant. Clara opened locker 114. Inside was minimal. No family photos. No colorful magnets or motivational quotes. There was a spare set of scrubs, an old, heavily creased green canvas field jacket, a small pocket knife with a non-locking 3-inch blade, legal under hospital policy, and a worn, leather-bound notebook with blank pages. She packed the items into the cardboard box with methodical precision. The jacket went in first, folded into a tight, military-grade rectangle to create a solid base. The notebook and knife followed. The door to the locker room swung open, and Sarah, a 24-year-old residency student, walked in, looking pale and exhausted. She saw Clara packing the box and stopped. "Clara, what are you doing? Shift doesn't end for an hour." "My shift is over, Sarah," Clara said, her back still turned as she closed the locker door. The metal latch clicked with a definitive, cold finality. Did Vance really do it? Sarah's voice rose, a mix of fatigue and indignation. "That's garbage. You ran the entire triage during the multi-car pileup last month. You didn't lose a single patient on your floor." Clara turned around, holding the box in both hands. She looked at the young doctor. "The hospital is a business, Sarah. Never mistake a business for a sanctuary. Keep your head down. Focus on the sutures, not the management." "But it's not right," Sarah insisted, her eyes welling with frustrated tears. "You deserve better than this. After everything you've done here." "I've done my job," Clara said mildly. "Nothing more." She walked past Sarah, giving the young woman a brief, grounding pat on the shoulder, a touch that carried an immense, steadying weight. As Clara stepped back into the main triage hallway, the overhead lights flickered once. It was a brief, almost imperceptible drop in voltage. To the rest of the staff, it was just the storm outside rattling the city grid. To Clara, who stood perfectly still in the middle of the hallway, listening to the pitch of the ventilation fans alter by a fraction of a hertz, it was the first indication that the perimeter of the building had just been compromised. The cardboard box felt light in Clara's arms, but her movements remained deliberate, measured against the subtle shifts of the building around her. She didn't head for the main entrance. Instead, she took the service corridor toward the south exit, a route that bypassed the main reception desk where the morning shift was beginning to gather. The backup generator kicked in with a low, deep thrum that vibrated through the soles of her shoes. The transition was smooth, less than 3 seconds, but the overhead fluorescent tubes returned to life at 80% luminosity, casting long, sharp shadows down the linoleum hallway. Clara stopped. She set the cardboard box on a stainless steel linen cart and stepped toward the narrow window of the south exit door. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the amber security lights of the ambulance bay. A standard power outage during a Pacific Northwest storm was common, but the sequence was wrong. The primary grid hadn't flickered from a lightning strike. The drop had been clean, instantaneous, and isolated to the hospital's specific transformer block on the corner of 12th and Morrison. She looked toward the perimeter fence. 200 yards away, through the gray veil of rain, the silhouette of a commercial utility van was parked illegally across the secondary access road. Its hazard lights weren't blinking. No technicians in high-visibility gear were climbing out to check the lines. The vehicle sat dark, its engine idling with a low, diesel rattle that she could feel more than she could hear. Clara checked her wristwatch. 4:42. The hospital's internal communications panel on the wall behind her emitted 3 short, digital chirps, the system's automated notification that the primary external telephone lines had dropped to 0 bandwidth. The cellular repeater on the roof followed a second later, its green diagnostic light shifting to a solid, dead amber. "Isolation protocol," Clara murmured to herself, her voice a quiet, clinical assessment. She reached into the cardboard box, her fingers moving past the folded green canvas jacket to the bottom of the stack. She slid the 3-inch pocket knife into the waistband of her scrubs, concealing it beneath the loose fabric of her tunic. Next, she pulled out a small, black plastic penlight. Not a standard medical pupil gauge, but an old tactical illuminator with a masked lens that restricted the beam to a narrow, non-reflective 3-degree cone. The heavy double doors at the end of the corridor groaned. Gary, the night shift security guard, walked through holding a half-empty styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. His uniform trousers were slightly frayed at the cuffs, and his duty belt sagged under the weight of a heavy flashlight and a radio that was currently emitting nothing but low-frequency white noise. "Hey, Clara," Gary said, shaking his head. "Generator's acting up again." The whole main desk lost the external lines. "Can't even get a dial tone to call the city." "You heading out?" "Gary," Clara said, her tone level, cutting through his casual fatigue without raising its pitch. "Where's the rest of your team?" "Rodriguez is up on 4, checking the psychiatric ward elevators." "What?" "Go back to the central security office," Clara said calmly. "Do not use the elevators. Take the service stairs. Lock the door from the inside. Turn off the monitors that face the hallway, and do not open it for anyone unless they use the hardwired emergency intercom." Gary blinked, his coffee cup pausing halfway to his mouth. He laughed, though it sounded forced. "Come on, Clara. It's just a transformer blew down the street. Happens every winter." Clara took one step closer to him. The distance between them shrank, and with it, the casual atmosphere of the hallway vanished. She didn't point, she didn't gesture, but her posture carried an absolute, freezing authority that made Gary's shoulders instantly stiffen. "Look at your radio, Gary," she said softly. "The static isn't from the storm. It's an active frequency sweep. Someone is broadcasting a localized white noise signal on the encrypted security band. Your phone doesn't work, your radio doesn't work, and the cameras outside went dark exactly 20 seconds before the lights dropped." Gary looked down at the small black box on his hip. The red transmit light was flickering rhythmically, a pattern that indicated an external override, not a dead battery. Who would do that?" Gary stammered, his face losing its color as the reality of his isolation began to set in. "People who don't want anyone looking out," Clara said, turning back to the window. "And people who don't want anyone getting out." Through the rain, the blacked-out SUVs pulled into the lower parking structure, their headlights turned off, their tires moving silently over the wet asphalt. The entry was not explosive. There was no shattering of glass or dramatic alarms. That was the first thing Clara noted as she withdrew into the deep shadow of the service alcove. The intruders understood discipline. They used a hydraulic spreader on the pneumatic locks of the north wing emergency doors, a silent, high-pressure breach that pop-clicked the reinforced steel frames with a sound no louder than a snapping branch. Clara stood motionless behind a stack of industrial laundry bins, her breathing shallow, rhythmic, and perfectly controlled. Through the gap in the plastic bins, she watched the north wing vestibule. 5 men stepped through the rain-drenched threshold. They moved in a wedge formation, their boots hitting the linoleum with muffled, rubberized thuds. They weren't wearing the bulky, theatrical gear of local SWAT teams. They wore lightweight, dark gray tactical smocks without insignia, low-profile ballistic plates, and high-cut maritime helmets equipped with night vision mounts. Their weapons were suppressed, short-barreled carbines, held at a strict low-ready position. Perimeter set, a voice muttered. It came from a lead operator, his tone flat, distorted slightly by a bone conduction throat microphone. Commencing sweep for the asset. Section 1, secure the central stairwell. Section 2, isolate the administrative hub. No external transmissions. Clara's mind instantly translated the deployment. They weren't here for a random robbery, and they weren't generic terrorists. They were a contracted kinetic solution team, professionals hired to sanitize a specific target. That target was currently on the 4th floor. Alejandro Vargas, a federal witness under protective custody who had been admitted 3 hours prior with a ruptured abdominal wound. From her position, Clara looked down at her silver watch. 4:46. The security guard, Gary, had ignored her advice. Instead of retreating to the security office, he had crept down the parallel hallway, his heavy maglite flashlight extended like a club, his boots squeaking loudly on the floor. "Hey, who's there? Show me your hands." Gary's voice echoed down the corridor, tight with a mixture of panic and artificial bravery. The rear operator of the paramilitary team didn't hesitate. He pivoted 45 degrees, his weapon tracking smoothly. He didn't fire. Firing created mess and noise. Instead, he closed the distance in 3 blindingly fast, predatory strides. Before Gary could swing the heavy flashlight, the operator caught the guard's wrist, twisted it inward until the bone popped, and drove the butt of his carbine directly into Gary's solar plexus. Gary collapsed into a breathless, wheezing heap on the floor. The operator immediately transitioned to a zip tie, binding Gary's hands behind his back with a harsh, plastic zip that sounded like tearing paper. Clara didn't move. Her muscles didn't tense. Every instinct in a normal human being would demand an intervention, a reckless charge to save colleague. But Clara knew the calculus of survival. A premature reveal was a wasted asset. She watched the lead operator look toward the administrative corridor, the exact direction where Marcus Vance was currently finalizing his morning financial reports. "Sweep the offices," the leader commanded. "Anyone found in the open gets bound and secured in the triage bay. If they resist, terminate with minimum noise." The team split with mechanical efficiency. 2 went toward the stairs. 2 went toward the offices. The remaining operator stood guard at the breach point, his weapon scanning the dark hallway, his eyes passing over the laundry alcove 3 times. He didn't see her. She had dissolved into the architecture. Clara slowly let her hand drop to her waistband, her fingers lightly touching the cold steel of the small pocket knife. She didn't draw it. She just held the grip, calculating the distance, the illumination, and the exact weight of the air in the room. The crisis was no longer arriving. It was here. The administrative hallway was darker than the main corridor, its emergency lights spaced further apart. Clara moved down the parallel maintenance track, her rubber-soled shoes making absolutely no sound against the raw concrete floor. She knew the layout of the wall panels. She slipped through utility access door just as the 2 operators from Section 2 rounded the far corner. Ahead, the lights were still on in Marcus Vance's office. Through the frosted glass, Vance's silhouette was rigid, frozen behind his desk. The door was kicked open with a sharp metallic strike. The first operator entered, his weapon raised, the muzzle tracking smoothly across the room before locking onto Vance's chest. The second operator remained in the doorway, scanning the hall. "Stand up," the first operator ordered. His voice was low, filtered through his throat mic, carrying no emotion. "Hands on your head." What is this?" Vance's voice cracked, completely stripped of its corporate authority. He pushed himself back into his chair, his hands shaking violently as he raised them. "I'm a director. I'm management. If this is about the pharmacy." "Quiet," the operator cut him off, stepping closer. He reached out with one gloved hand, grabbing Vance by the collar of his tailored suit and dragging him over the desk. The digital tablet hit the floor, its glass screen shattering in the silence. From the shadow of the utility alcove 10 feet away, Clara watched. Her eyes were fixed on the second operator guarding the door. His weight was shifted onto his right leg, his weapon lowered slightly as he focused on his partner inside. He was complacent, assuming the hospital was entirely filled with defenseless civilians. Clara stepped out of the shadows. She didn't run. A run created displacement in the air. It made sound. She closed the distance in 2 long, fluid strides. Before the second operator could sense the shift in the room, Clara's left hand shot forward, her thumb and forefinger driving deep into the soft tissue beneath his jawline. A precise, agonizing pressure point strike that paralyzed his vocal cords and flooded his nervous system with white-hot pain. With her right hand, she caught the barrel of his suppressed carbine, redirecting the muzzle toward the floor before he could pull the trigger. She didn't swing a punch. Instead, she used his own momentum, stepping into his pivot and driving her knee into the side of his fibula. The bone didn't break, but the joint buckled. The operator went down on one knee, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his eyes wide with sudden animal terror. Clara didn't look at his face. Her fingers wrapped around the retention sling of his weapon, sliding it over his helmet with a smooth, practiced twist. She unlatched his sidearm from its Kydex holster, dropped the magazine into her scrub pocket, and cycled the slide to eject the chambered round. The brass casing fell into her palm with a soft, metallic click. Inside the office, the first operator heard the scuffle and spun around. Vogel, what? He didn't finish. Clara was already standing in the doorway, holding his partner's carbine at a low, steady rest. She wasn't aiming at his head or his chest. She was aiming at the unarmored gap beneath his ballistic plate. Drop the weapon, Clara said. Her voice wasn't loud. It carried no anger, no theatrical threat. It was the calm, absolute tone of an instructor who had delivered the same directive 1,000 times on a live-fire range. The operator looked at her navy blue scrubs, then down at his partner, who was convulsing silently on the floor, unable to stand. He looked at the way Clara held the carbine, her stance perfectly bladed, her weight distributed for maximum recoil absorption, her finger resting precisely along the frame, not the trigger. He realized, in a single, freezing second, that he wasn't looking at a nurse. "Who the hell are you?" the operator whispered, his weapon lowering by a fraction of an inch. "Someone who used to write your training manuals," Clara said softly. "Set it down." Gently. The first operator did not drop his weapon. His eyes flickered down to Clara's hands, measuring the distance, calculating his own reaction time against the calm stillness of her frame. He was a professional. He knew that a fraction of a second was all it took to close a gap. He chose wrong. As his muzzle began to rise by a millimeter, Clara didn't pull the trigger. She didn't fire a single shot that would echo through the concrete corridors. Instead, she took a single, explosive step forward, driving the heavy buttstock of her captured carbine directly into the center of his tactical helmet's night vision shroud. The impact was sharp, a hollow crack that rattled through the room. The force sent the operator backward into Vance's desk. Before he could recover his balance, Clara caught his weapon arm, twisted the wrist outward with a leverage lock that bypassed his upper body strength entirely, and slammed his forearm against the edge of the hardwood desk. The short-barreled rifle slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. Clara stepped back, her breathing entirely unchanged, her weapon tracking between the two incapacitated men. On the floor, the first operator she had struck was finally regaining his breath, dragging himself against the wall, clutching his throat. The second man lay stunned beside the desk, a thin trickle of blood running from his nose down his chin. Marcus Vance was pressed so hard against the back of his executive chair that the leather groaned under the weight. His face was the color of chalk, his eyes darting from the groaning. Heavily armed mercenaries to the quiet woman who had cleaned out her locker an hour ago. "Clara," Vance's voice was barely a squeak. "What'd you just do?" "Sit down, Mr. Vance," Clara said, her eyes never leaving the two operators. She reached down without looking, picked up both drop carbines by their slings, and slung them over her left shoulder. She kicked the loose sidearms under the heavy steel filing cabinet in the corner. "And stay away from the windows. They have the whole building," Vance stammered, his fingers trembling as he clutched his tie. "I heard them on the radio. They're looking for someone in the ICU. They're going to kill everyone." "They're looking for a specific target," Clara corrected him calmly. "Killing everyone creates a logistical complication they cannot afford. They want a clean exit. If they get desperate, that changes." She stepped over the first operator, who watched her with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Clara reached into his utility vest, pulling out his encrypted tactical radio and 3 extra magazines. She didn't take his knife or his flashbangs. She took only what she needed to control the space. "Who are you?" the operator on the floor rasped, his voice hoarse from the pressure point strike. "There's no federal unit stationed here. We checked the local manifests." Clara paused in the doorway. She adjusted the strap of the captured rifle so it sat hidden beneath her oversized navy blue scrub top, the silhouette masked by the loose fabric. You check the active manifests, Clara said softly, her voice carrying a cold, heavy finality. You should have checked the retirement logs. She turned back to Vance, her expression as unreadable as it had been during her termination meeting. Stay here. If anyone else enters this room without using the code word Bravo 9, you drop to the floor and you do not look them in the eye. Do you understand? Vance could only nod, his mouth open, completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that the most dangerous person in the hospital wasn't the men with the masks. It was the woman he had just fired for being too quiet. Clara stepped back into the dark corridor, the door clicking shut behind her, disappearing into the shadows of the north wing. The air in the maintenance tunnels beneath the central corridor was thick with the smell of damp concrete and hot copper lines. Clara moved with a slow, rhythmic gait, keeping her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. Her pulse remained at a steady 60 beats per minute. In her line of work, panic was a luxury that always carried a body count. She stopped at the foot of the service ladder, leading to the ICU's main utility access. Above her, the floorboards vibrated with the distinct, heavy thud of military-issue boots. Suddenly, the tactical radio she had taken from the first operator crackled to life in her scrub pocket. The volume was dialed down to a whisper, but in the enclosed concrete space, the words were sharp. Leader, this is Section 1. We have a situation in the administrative sector. Vogel and Miller are non-responsive. Their tracking beacons are stationary, but they aren't answering the tactical frequency. A brief pause followed, filled with the low hiss of atmospheric static. Then, the team leader's voice came through, cold, thin, and entirely pragmatic. Sweep the sector. If an external agency has breached the perimeter, we transition to hard containment protocols. Collect all remaining facility personnel and bring them to the main triage desk. If the asset cannot be moved within 5 minutes, we sanitize the entire floor. Clara didn't blink. She knew exactly what hard containment meant. It meant the professional killers were about to eliminate the variables. She climbed the ladder, pushing open the heavy metal floor grate with a slow, controlled lift that prevented the hinges from groaning. She emerged into the linen supply room directly adjacent to the main ICU nurses station. Through the reinforced wire glass of the supply room door, she saw the remaining 3 operators setting their perimeter. They had dragged Marcus Vance out of his office, his hands zip-tied behind his back. Beside him, Sarah, the young resident doctor, was kneeling on the cold floor, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A third administrative clerk was pinned against the wall by the barrel of a suppressed carbine. The team leader stood in the center of the floor, his weapon held at a low, casual rest. He didn't look angry. He looked like a project manager facing a minor technical delay. You have 30 seconds to give me the override key for the ICU isolation ward, the leader said, looking down at Vance. I don't have it, Vance cried, his voice echoing shrilly off the linoleum walls. The electronic keys are rotational. Only the floor supervisor has them. And she isn't here. Please, just take what you want. I have a family. The leader didn't answer. He simply shifted his stance, his thumb sliding the selector switch of his carbine from safe to semi-automatic. The small, metallic click sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He raised the muzzle, aligning it with the center of Sarah's forehead. The doctor, then the leader said evenly, 5 seconds. From behind the wire glass, Clara's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. This was the calculation she had hoped to avoid. To intervene now meant giving up her element of surprise against a coordinated 3-man element in an open hallway with zero cover. To remain hidden meant allowing a 24-year-old civilian to die for a conflict she had no part in. Clara reached down to her waistband. She drew the small, 3-inch pocket knife. She didn't open the blade. Instead, she took the heavy, steel-plated tactical radio from her pocket, wrapped her fingers tightly around the antenna, and struck the heavy metal door frame of the supply closet twice. Thud! Thud! The 3 operators pivoted instantly, their weapons tracking to the source of the noise with mechanical precision. Section 1. We have movement in the linen repository, the nearest operator muttered, moving toward the door in a tight, defensive crouch. Clara stood directly behind the door, her body pressed flat against the wall, her breathing stopped entirely. She had deliberately chosen her ground. She was forcing them to come to her, one by one, through a narrow, fatal funnel where their numbers meant nothing and her restraint would be tested to its absolute limit. The door to the linen repository opened inward with a swift, controlled jerk. The first operator entered with his weapon raised high, his torso bladed, ready to clear the left corner. He never got the chance to look right. Clara moved before the door had even finished its swing. She didn't use the captured carbine. The long barrel was too cumbersome for a tight entry sweep. Instead, she used the blunt but of the closed pocket knife, striking the operator precisely on the exposed nerve cluster behind his ear. His vision blurred instantly, his knees turning to water. As he stumbled forward, Clara caught his tactical vest, absorbing his weight silently, and guided his unconscious body down onto a pile of surplus green scrubs. The second operator, standing 5 feet back in the corridor, noticed the sudden absence of his partner's silhouette. Vogel, report. Clara stepped directly into the open doorway. She didn't hide. She stood perfectly upright under the harsh emergency lights, holding the first operator's suppressed rifle securely against her shoulder. He's down, Clara said, her voice cutting through the hum of the ventilation system with freezing clarity. And if you drop your shoulder by another inch, you'll join him. The team leader and the second operator froze. The second man's weapon was half raised, caught in a terrible tactical limbo. He was looking at a woman in navy scrubs, but the muzzle of her rifle was aligned perfectly with the soft seam of his ballistic collar. She wasn't shaking. Her eyes didn't blink against the glare. "You're the retired asset," the leader said, his voice dropping an octave as he realized the true nature of his opposition. He slowly stepped back, keeping Marcus Vance's position directly between himself and Clara's line of fire. "The ghost from the Black Sea operations. They said you died in a clinic in Bucharest. They lied to save your employers the embarrassment," Clara said, her finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. She didn't look at Vance, whose face was covered in a cold sweat, nor at Sarah, who was staring up from the floor in absolute bewilderment. "You're out of your jurisdiction, Commander," the leader spat, trying to buy time as his left hand subtly reached toward the flashbang mounted on his chest rig. "This is a private contract. The witness dies tonight. Move aside, and you walk out of here with your pension intact. You have 4 men unconscious in the lower wings. Your communications are jammed, and your local extraction driver left the perimeter 3 minutes ago when he realized the federal transponder grid went live," Clara said evenly. It was a bluff. The extraction driver was likely still waiting, but she delivered the lie with such clinical, absolute certainty that the leader's eyes flickered to the side for a microsecond. That microsecond was all she needed. Clara fired a single, low-velocity round. The suppressed pop was followed immediately by the sharp shatter of the glass fire extinguisher cabinet directly behind the leader's head. The sudden explosion of safety glass and pressurized white chemical powder filled the narrow corridor with a blinding, choking fog. Vance screamed, dropping to the floor. The second operator fired blindly into the cloud, the bright muzzle flashes illuminating the dust like lightning. But Clara wasn't where he was aiming. She had dropped into a low roll the moment she pulled the trigger, moving under the line of fire. She emerged from the white chemical mist right in front of the second operator. With a sweeping lift of her leg, she took out his remaining good knee, sending him crashing hard into the linoleum. Before he could recover, she drove the heel of her hand into his chin, snapping his head back against the concrete wall. He went limp. Now, only the leader remained, stumbling back through the white smoke toward the heavy double doors of the ICU isolation ward, his weapon raised, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. He had lost his team, his tactical advantage, and his composure. He was no longer a professional technician. He was a cornered animal. The white chemical dust from the fire extinguisher hung thick in the air, settling like frost over the linoleum floor. The team leader retreated until his back hit the reinforced steel doors of the ICU isolation ward. His breath was ragged, his chest heaving under his tactical plate. He raised his suppressed rifle, his hands shaking slightly as he aimed blindly into the settling fog. "Stay back," he yelled, his professional composure completely shattered. "I'll take the whole floor down. I swear to God, I'll detonate the oxygen lines." Clara stepped out of the mist. She wasn't running, and she wasn't aiming her weapon. The captured carbine hung loosely from its sling across her shoulder. Her hands were visible, relaxed, and entirely empty. Her face remained a mask of absolute, unbothered calm, as if she were merely delivering a cup of water to a patient in room 4. "You won't detonate the lines," Clara said softly, her voice cutting through his panic, "because you don't have the secondary thermite charge required to crack the reinforced casing. And you don't want to die in municipal hospital for a contract that has already defaulted." Before the leader could respond, a low, tectonic vibration shook the structure of the building. It wasn't the storm. It was the synchronized, heavy thud of twin-rotor MH-47 Chinook helicopters hovering low over the hospital's roof. A second later, the heavy reinforced glass of the lobby entrance 2 floors below shattered completely. The sound of flashbangs echoed up the stairwell, sharp, rapid cracks that signaled a high-velocity Tier 1 entry sequence. The double doors at the end of the ICU hallway were violently thrown open. 6 operators in full desert digital combat gear, carrying specialized night vision arrays and specialized assault weapons, flooded the corridor in a perfect, overwhelming wedge. Their weapon lights cut through the remaining chemical smoke like lasers. "Federal asset security. Drop your weapon. Drop it now," the point man roared, his laser sight instantly locking onto the paramilitary leader's chest. 3 more dots painted the leader's forehead. The paramilitary leader looked at the incoming force, then at Clara, who simply stood there, watching him with those cold, gray eyes. Realizing the absolute futility of his position, his hands went limp. The carbine slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the floor. He dropped to his knees, raising his hands in total surrender. 2 of the elite operators immediately tackled him to the ground, securing his wrists with heavy-duty zip ties. The commander of the incoming Tier 1 unit, a tall, heavily built Master Chief with a weathered face and a silver trident pinned to his chest, stepped through the stack of men. His eyes swept the corridor, taking in the 4 unconscious, zip-tied mercenaries on the floor, the broken glass, and the absolute lack of civilian casualties. Finally, his eyes stopped on Clara. The Master Chief froze. His aggressive, high-readiness posture dissolved instantly. He slowly lowered his rifle, letting it hang by its 3-point sling. He stood at rigid, absolute military attention. "Ma'am," the Master Chief said, his voice deep, rough, and filled with a profound, unyielding reverence. The operators behind him, recognizing the shift in their commander, looked at Clara. One by one, their muzzles lowered. They stood perfectly still, acknowledging a legend they had only heard about in the classified history briefs at Coronado. Marcus Vance, still sitting on the floor with his hands tied behind his back, looked up at the elite soldiers, then at the quiet night shift nurse. His jaw went slack. The room was dead silent, save for the rain outside. The corridor filled rapidly with federal agents, tactical gear clinking against tactical gear, as the perimeter was secured. Medics from the elite extraction unit moved past Clara, heading straight for the ICU isolation ward to secure the primary witness. None of them questioned her presence. They simply cleared her path with hushed, professional deference. Marcus Vance was finally cut free from his zip ties by a young operator. He stood up on shaky legs, dusting off his tailored trousers, though his eyes never left Clara. The synthetic confidence he had carried into the exit interview was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed awe. "Clara," Vance stepped forward, his voice cracking as he looked at the elite soldiers standing at attention around them. We didn't know. The board. If we had any idea who you were, the administrative changes wouldn't have applied to your position. Please, we can rectify this immediately. Your contract can be reinstated with full seniority." We could discuss a management role. Clara didn't let him finish. She reached down to the floor, her movements smooth and unhurried, and picked up the small, damp cardboard box containing her personal belongings. The folded green canvas jacket, the blank notebook, and the small pocket knife she had quietly slipped back inside. The math still dictates the outcome, Mr. Vance, Clara said mildly. You have a budget ceiling. I'm no longer a line item. Ma'am, the Master Chief stepped forward, his expression grave. An escort vehicle is waiting in the lower bay. Washington has already been notified of the breach. They are requesting a full debrief at the regional command hub. You don't have to walk out into the storm. Clara looked at the veteran operator. For the first time all night, a faint, barely perceptible softening appeared at the corners of her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of a shared past and a shared burden. Thank you, Master Chief, Clara said softly, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had earned her peace 1,000 times over. But my shift is officially over. She adjusted the box under her arm and turned away from the flashing strobe lights, the federal radios, and the crowd of stunned hospital administrators. She walked down the central corridor toward the south exit, her scuffed trail shoes making a rhythmic, steady sound against the clean linoleum. Nobody followed her. Nobody tried to stop her. She pushed through the heavy double doors of the south exit, stepping out into the cool, gray dawn of the Pacific Northwest. The rain had slowed to a soft, persistent mist. The city was just beginning to wake up, entirely unaware of the war that had been fought and won in the dark. Clara walked past the line of idling, blacked-out federal SUVs, her head down, her green canvas jacket pulled tight against the morning chill. As she reached the perimeter gate, she didn't look back at the flashing sirens or the building she had protected. She simply turned the corner, blending seamlessly into the early morning fog, disappearing into the quiet anonymity she had fought so hard to keep.